She was only a child when she left the forest, her life pulled away by fire and fear. But the bear never forgot. Every year, through snow and sun, he returned to the same clearing, waiting, watching, as though he remembered her promise to come back. Clara had not set foot in the forest for nearly 20 years, but the memory of it was stitched into her bones. She remembered the sharp smell of pine needles crushed under her shoes, the way the sunlight fractured through the tall branches, scattering light like shards of glass across the mossy ground. As a child, this place had been more than a home, it had been her sanctuary, her playground, her world. And somewhere within that vast living cathedral of trees, there had been the bear. Her earliest memories of him were almost dreamlike. She would be gathering wildflowers along the narrow streams, or climbing fallen logs with scraped knees, and then she would feel it, that prickling awareness along her neck that she wasn't alone. Turning, she'd see him there, a massive shadow among the trees, watching her with quiet, unblinking eyes. At first, terror had surged through her small body, her heart thundering as she froze. But he had never approached in menace. He did not lunge, did not roar, did not bare his teeth. He only stood, silent, scar glinting pale across one side of his face. As the weeks passed, fear gave way to something stranger, recognition. Clara began to understand that he was not just an intruder into her world, but a part of it, a creature woven into the same fabric of forest life that sustained her family. Soon, she began to speak to him. She would whisper to him in hushed tones while picking berries, as though confiding her secrets in a companion. "I'm afraid of the dark," she once told him, crouched in the clearing with a bundle of flowers clutched in her hands. His ears twitched, and she imagined he understood. Another day, she told him about her dreams of leaving the forest someday, of seeing the world beyond the mountains. He listened in the same way, silent, steady, yet somehow present. Her father never knew about these meetings. He was a practical man, too hardened by years of chopping wood and braving winters to entertain the idea that a bear could be more than a danger. Her mother, though softer, would have forbade it too. So Clara kept the secret close to her heart, convinced that if she spoke of it, the fragile bond would break. But the forest was not invincible. One summer's night, a lantern fell. She remembered the screams, the rush of footsteps, her father's shouts, the thick black smoke swallowing the cabin. They had fled with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Clara, choking and crying, looked back once into the blaze of fire consuming the only home she had ever known. Somewhere beyond the smoke, she wondered if the bear had seen it too, if he had been close enough to hear her cries. She had wanted to turn back, to look for him, but her mother's grip was iron around her wrist. That was the last time she saw the forest as a child. The years that followed carried her far away. She grew older, taller, her hair darkening, her childish voice replaced by the steadiness of adulthood. But no matter how much she tried to bury it, the forest never left her. At night, she dreamed of the clearing. She dreamed of the bear's dark eyes, patient and deep. She dreamed of that scar that made him unique, unforgettable. She could still hear herself whispering promises to him, "I'll come back. I won't forget." And though she hadn't yet returned, part of her had never left. Back in the village, she occasionally overheard stories. Farmers spoke of a great bear that wandered the woods every spring, scarred and silent. Hunters avoided him. Old women muttered about omens, about the creature that returned without fail, year after year. Clara listened, heart pounding, though she never dared admit what she suspected. She knew it was him. She knew it was the bear she had left behind. What struck her most wasn't just that he survived, but that he returned, always to the same place. People whispered of how he lingered in the clearing where no house now stood, as though waiting for something unseen. He didn't attack livestock, didn't raid villages. He only waited. And the more she heard, the more she felt the pull of memory tugging her back. By the time Clara reached her 30s, the weight of it had grown unbearable. One evening, sitting by the hearth in her new home far from the forest, she found herself holding an old ribbon, one she had once tied around her hair as a child. It smelled faintly of smoke still, though years had passed. She pressed it to her chest, and for the first time in 2 decades, she allowed herself to whisper aloud the words she had once told the bear, "I'll come back." The decision was made. She packed lightly, more out of instinct than need, for she knew the forest would not welcome her with the same simplicity it once had. She was no longer a child. The woods could be dangerous, unpredictable. And yet, she felt certain, bone-deep certain, that he would be there. That he had always been there. And so, as dawn broke, Clara stood at the forest's edge once more. The trees loomed higher than she remembered, darker, as though guarding their secrets more closely. Her heart thundered in her chest. But with each step, the air grew more familiar. The smell of pine returned, the rustle of branches whispered like old friends. And somewhere, deep in the silence between sounds, she thought she could feel him. Waiting. Clara's first steps into the forest were hesitant, but soon, old instincts began to stir. Though 2 decades had passed, her body seemed to remember paths long erased by time. The soft give of moss beneath her boots, the way branches arched and bent in familiar places, the chorus of distant birds, all of it awakened something buried deep inside her. Each sound, each scent, carried her back to her childhood, to afternoons spent exploring without fear, when she believed the forest belonged to her. Now, though, the forest felt older, weightier, as though watching her return with quiet judgment. She moved slowly, each step deliberate. The air was cool and damp, filled with the faint perfume of pine sap and earth. Somewhere in the distance, water trickled, a stream still carving the same winding path through the woods. She paused, crouching for a moment to let her fingers brush the moss-covered ground. For a second, her eyes stung with tears. She whispered, "I'm back," almost afraid of how the forest might answer. As she pressed on, Clara found herself retracing the invisible map etched in her memory. She crossed a slope where she once gathered herbs with her mother, the soil rich and dark, wildflowers still thriving. She passed a gnarled oak where she and her father had carved initials, though now the bark had stretched, scars of wood nearly swallowing the letters. She paused there for a long while, pressing her palm against it. "You're still here," she murmured. And then came the clearing. It was smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she was simply larger now. The grass grew uneven and wild, with pockets of earth bare where animals had passed. Around its edges, trees had thickened, branches curling inward as though trying to reclaim the space. But Clara recognized it instantly. This was where she had once seen him most clearly, where she had whispered secrets and made promises. Her chest tightened, and her pulse raced. The villagers had been right, every story she had overheard echoed here in her memory. This was where the bear had returned, year after year. She scanned the clearing, every muscle tense with anticipation, though she told herself it was foolish to hope. Perhaps he was gone. Perhaps he had died long ago, and the stories were just echoes. Yet, the forest was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. No birds sang overhead, no branches swayed. It was as though the entire world was holding its breath. Clara stood in the middle of the clearing, her arms wrapped around herself, and whispered the words she had carried for 20 years. I came back. The silence stretched. Then, somewhere in the shadows beyond the tree line, there was movement. Clara's heart lurched. The shape was enormous, darker than the undergrowth, steady in its stride. The sound of his paws pressing into the soil carried across the clearing, slow and deliberate. She froze, caught between fear and an aching recognition that tightened her throat. And then she saw him. The bear emerged into the light, his massive body filling the space with presence. His fur was thick and dark, patches of it streaked with silver now from age. His face was the same, wide, solemn, and marked by that pale scar near one eye. The moment her gaze fell on it, all doubt vanished. It was him. Tears blurred her vision as her chest heaved with breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She was a child again in that instant, staring into those eyes for the first time. But now, she was grown, and the weight of years hung between them. Still, he stopped just short of the clearing's center, lowering his massive head slightly, watching her with the same silence he always had. Clara's lips trembled. You remembered. The bear did not move closer. He did not roar or paw at the ground. He simply stood, the faint rise and fall of his chest the only sign of life in his statue-like stillness. And in that stillness, she felt the truth settle deep within her. He had been waiting. Not for anyone else. Not for anything else. For her. Clara's legs nearly gave way as she sank to the ground, overwhelmed. She pressed her palms to her eyes, sobs shaking her shoulders, though not from fear. The years she had spent wondering, the guilt she had carried for leaving him behind, the promise she thought she had broken, all of it spilled out in her tears. When she finally lowered her hands, the bear was still there. Closer now, though not near enough to touch. His massive body blocked part of the clearing, a sentinel of memory and loyalty. Clara drew in a shuddering breath, whispering, I never forgot you. The forest, once silent, seemed to exhale with her. Leaves shifted, a bird called faintly in the distance, and Clara realized she was no longer afraid. For the first time in years, she felt whole. But deep inside, questions lingered. Why had he waited? Why had he returned every year? Was it memory, instinct, or something beyond what she could understand? And perhaps the bigger question, could she stay this time, or was the forest only meant to remind her of what she once had? Clara rose slowly, wiping her face with the back of her hand, her eyes never leaving his. The bear watched her, still calm, still steady. And for the first time since she was a child, she didn't feel like she was facing the forest alone. Clara stood in the clearing, her breath shallow, her heart pounding against her ribs as though it wanted to leap free. The bear remained where he was, massive and silent, his dark eyes fixed on her with a weight that rooted her to the spot. She thought of how, as a child, she had once spoken to him as though he could understand. Now, as a woman grown, she wondered if she had been right all along. His stillness wasn't just animal instinct, it was presence, deliberate, focused, purposeful. She took a slow step forward, her boots sinking into the damp grass. The bear didn't move. His broad shoulders rose and fell with each breath, a rhythm that somehow calmed her even as her body trembled. She whispered, "Do you know me?" Her voice cracked on the words, but she forced herself to keep her gaze steady. The bear blinked, slow and heavy, as though acknowledging her question. Clara remembered how he had done the same when she was a child, a single, deliberate blink that had felt more like a nod than anything else. She gasped softly, covering her mouth with one hand. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes again, but this time they were warm, filled with something closer to relief than sorrow. She lowered her hand and let the words she had carried for so long spill out. I thought I lost you. I thought the fire took everything. But you waited, all this time, you waited. The bear shifted his weight slightly, his massive paw pressing into the soil with a soft crunch. He did not come closer, but he did not leave either. Clara could see the years etched into him now, the faint streaks of gray in his fur, the way his movements were slower, heavier. And yet, there was strength in him still. A quiet resilience that had carried him back to this clearing, year after year, without fail. Clara's mind wandered back to the stories she had overheard in the village. Farmers saying they saw him wander near the old riverbank. Hunters whispering about how he never attacked but always returned to the same spot. They had called it strange, unnatural even, but Clara saw it for what it was. It was memory. It was loyalty. It was a bond that had refused to break. Her knees buckled slightly, and she sat down on the grass, folding her legs beneath her like she had done as a little girl. The clearing seemed to hold them both in its embrace, as though the years that had stretched between them were nothing more than threads snapping away. Clara tilted her face toward him. I'm sorry, she said softly. I didn't want to leave. I wanted to come back, but life, it kept pulling me away. Still, I never stopped thinking about you. Every spring, I wondered if you were here. The bear's ear twitched, his gaze unwavering. Clara swallowed hard, drawing her coat tighter around her. She had expected fear to overwhelm her in this moment, the rational terror of sitting so close to a creature that could end her life with a single swipe. But instead, what she felt was peace. An odd, unexpected calm, as though something long unsettled inside her had finally been set right. For a while, she simply sat there, and he stood. The forest returned to its rhythm around them. Birds chirped hesitantly again, squirrels rustled in the branches above. A breeze swept through the clearing, tugging strands of her hair loose, and she thought back to the ribbon she had clutched the night before leaving for this journey. She wished she had brought it with her. She wanted to tie it to something here, leave proof that she had returned. The bear shifted again, lowering his head slightly as though settling into a more relaxed stance. Clara noticed how his scar caught the sunlight, a pale mark that seemed to glow faintly against his dark fur. She remembered how, as a child, she had once asked him what had caused it, whispering silly guesses aloud. Did you fight another bear? She had teased. Or maybe a wolf? Now, looking at it again, she felt the gravity of time. Whatever had left that mark had happened long before her. He had carried it into their bond, just as she now carried her scars of memory. Clara hesitated, then stretched one hand out in front of her, palm open. She did not expect him to come closer. She knew better than to demand what trust had to offer freely. But it was instinct, a child's instinct carried into adulthood. A gesture she had always wanted to try but had never dared. It's me, she whispered. Clara. The bear's eyes flicked to her hand, then back to her face. For a moment, the silence was absolute, so thick she could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Then, with a slow, almost reverent motion, he stepped forward. Just one step. The ground seemed to shake beneath his weight, but Clara held her ground, her arm still extended though it trembled. Her breath caught. He was closer now than he had been since she arrived. She could see the detail of his fur, the rise and fall of his chest, the flecks of dust clinging to his coat. Her hand hovered in the space between them, and though he did not bridge it fully, his presence filled it. Clara lowered her hand slowly, not wanting to push further than he would allow. Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "That's enough," she whispered. "You're here. I'm here. That's enough." The bear settled again, lowering onto his haunches in a way that struck Clara as oddly deliberate, as if he, too, was acknowledging that this was not just chance. This was reunion. And in that moment, Clara realized something she hadn't expected. She wasn't just visiting. She wasn't here to peek into the past and leave again. She was here because the forest was still part of her, because this bond had never let her go. The question now wasn't whether she would return, it was whether she would ever leave again. The sun had shifted higher now, spilling more light into the clearing, softening the edges of the moment. Clara could hear the hum of insects in the grass, the rustling of the forest resuming around her as if it too recognized the reunion. Yet all her focus remained on the bear, his steady, silent presence anchoring her in a way nothing else in her life had managed to do for years. Clara realized she was shaking. It wasn't fear, it was release. For so long, she had carried the burden of memory, the uncertainty of whether he was alive, whether he remembered her. That burden now fell away piece by piece with every second he stayed, every breath he took in her presence. "I thought you'd be gone," she admitted quietly, her voice catching. "Animals don't wait like people do. That's what I told myself. But you," she trailed off, overwhelmed by the enormity of it. The bear shifted slightly, his massive frame lowering so that he rested more comfortably in the grass. The gesture struck her with a wave of tenderness, as though he had chosen to sit and share the space with her. The sight made her laugh softly, though tears blurred her vision again. "You always had more patience than anyone I've ever known," she said. "More than me, even. You waited when I couldn't." She let herself sink back, leaning on her hands, her eyes never leaving him. Memories came in waves. She remembered lying in this clearing as a child, staring up at the sky, babbling nonsense stories to him while he stood in the shade of the trees. She remembered the way she used to close her eyes, pretending she could hear his answers in the wind. At the time, she thought it was all in her imagination. But sitting here now, with him still watching her so intently, she wondered if maybe she had been hearing something real all along. Not words, but a kind of presence that filled the silence between them. The wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of earth and pine. Clara drew her knees up, wrapping her arms around them. "Do you know what it meant, that you were here?" she whispered. "When I was small, when the nights were too loud with storms and I was too scared to sleep, I'd think about you out here, standing in the dark, unafraid. I told myself if you were brave enough to stay, then I could be brave enough to keep going." Her voice cracked. She pressed her forehead to her knees, a sob breaking free. She had thought that the years had buried her childhood feelings too deeply to surface again, but being here unraveled her. Everything she had held back poured out, the grief of losing her home, the guilt of leaving him behind, the longing to return when life had taken her elsewhere. And underneath it all, the steady knowledge that he had never abandoned the promise they shared. When she finally lifted her head again, the bear had inched closer. Not much, just enough to close some of the space between them. His massive paws pressed softly into the earth, his breath a slow, even rhythm. Clara's chest tightened, but she did not flinch. Instead, she reached for her pack, fumbling for the bread she had brought. It wasn't much, but it was something. She tore off a piece, her hand trembling as she set it on the grass a few feet in front of her. "You probably don't even want this," she said, forcing a shaky smile. "But it feels wrong not to offer." For a moment, he did nothing. Then, with a slow deliberation that made her breath catch, he leaned forward, his great muzzle brushing the grass as he sniffed the bread. He didn't eat it, not right away. Instead, he lifted his head again, his eyes meeting hers as though weighing the gesture itself rather than the food. Clara swallowed hard, her heart racing. The message felt unmistakable. He wasn't here for bread. "You came back for me," she whispered. And then, after a pause, the bear lowered his head again and gently took the bread into his mouth. The simple act undid her completely. She pressed her hand to her chest, sobbing openly now, not with grief but with gratitude. The bear finished the offering and settled back, his scar catching the sunlight once more. Clara's gaze lingered on that scar. As a child, she had always wanted to believe it was a mark of survival, proof of his strength. Now, as an adult, she understood it was more than that. It was a symbol of endurance, just as their bond had endured across years and distance. She sat there with him for what felt like hours, the world narrowing down to just the two of them. Time didn't matter in the clearing. The years that had passed seemed irrelevant. What mattered was that they were here, together again. But Clara knew this couldn't last forever. The sun was rising higher, and shadows stretched shorter. She would have to leave eventually. The thought struck her like a knife, and she whispered into the stillness, "What happens now?" The bear didn't answer, not in words, at least. But as he shifted slightly, lowering himself fully onto the ground as if to rest, Clara felt something settle inside her. Maybe she didn't need an answer. Maybe the act of returning was enough for now. She had kept her promise. She had come back. For the first time since she left as a child, Clara felt at peace. The clearing had settled into a quiet rhythm, as though time itself had slowed to honor the reunion. Clara sat cross-legged, her palms pressed to the earth, feeling the faint vibrations of the bear's weight where he rested nearby. For the first time in decades, she felt grounded, as though her life, which had been scattered and pulled in so many directions, had finally aligned with something ancient and true. She studied him with quiet reverence. His fur was matted in places, streaked with silver and dark with age. His breath rose and fell steadily, each exhale a soft rumble that carried across the clearing. He was older, yes, but still magnificent. The scar across his eye had not faded, instead, it seemed more pronounced, a permanent reminder of battles survived. Clara wondered how many winters he had endured, how many storms had battered the forest in the years she was gone. She realized she wanted to know his story, all of it. Her own life had been defined by absence. She had lived in towns far from here, surrounded by people who never knew what she had lost. She had worked in fields, tended homes, laughed at festivals, but always with a hollowness inside her. Now, sitting across from the bear, she understood why. The forest had never left her, and he had always been the heart of it. She cleared her throat softly, hesitant but determined. "Do you remember," she began, her voice low, "the time I left berries here for you?" The bear's ears twitched slightly, his head lifting to regard her. Clara smiled faintly at the memory. "I was so proud of myself. I thought I was brave, leaving something behind instead of running away. I came back the next day, and they were gone. I never knew if it was you, but I told myself it had to be." The bear blinked, slow and steady, and Clara let out a soft laugh. "I guess I have my answer now." She leaned back, letting her hands support her weight, and glanced at the trees overhead. Sunlight filtered through, casting shifting patterns across the ground. She remembered climbing those trees as a child, remembered how her mother scolded her for returning home with pine sap sticky on her skin. She remembered lying in the grass, watching clouds roll by while the bear lingered at the edge of the clearing, always watching but never intruding. Her smile faded, replaced by something heavier. "I thought about you every spring," she admitted. "Every time the snow melted, I wondered if you were still here. If you were still waiting. I wanted to come back sooner. I really did. But life doesn't let you choose as much as you think it will when you're a child." She felt her throat tighten, but she pressed on. "I got older. I worked where I could. I tried to build a life, but it always felt temporary, like I was waiting for something I couldn't name. Now I know it was this. It was you." The bear shifted, lifting his massive head as though acknowledging her confession. Clara watched him closely, her heart thudding in her chest. She wanted to believe he understood. Maybe not her words, but the meaning behind them. The presence of her. The echo of a promise she had kept by returning. Her gaze softened. "You taught me something without ever saying a word. You taught me that waiting means something. That loyalty isn't just a human thing." She paused, searching for the right words. "You showed me what it means to stay." The bear exhaled heavily, lowering his head to the grass. It was not a sign of dismissal but of ease, as though her presence soothed him enough to rest. Clara felt a warmth flood her chest. She reached into her pack again, pulling out the ribbon she had tucked inside that morning. It was faded now, frayed at the edges, but she had carried it for years. She tied it gently around a small branch at the clearing's edge, letting it flutter in the breeze. "There," she whispered. "Proof I came back." Her eyes stung with fresh tears as she turned back to him. The ribbon was a bridge between the child she had been and the woman she had become, and the bear's steady presence anchored it all. She wondered if she should speak her old promise aloud again, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she simply placed her hand on the earth, palm flat, as though connecting herself to the forest through its soil. The bear stirred slightly, his gaze flicking to her, then to the ribbon. Clara could almost imagine that he understood its meaning, that he recognized it as a marker of her return. She drew in a shaky breath, feeling a sense of belonging she hadn't known since childhood. Still, beneath the peace, questions lingered. How long would this last? Would he continue returning year after year, even now that she had come back? Or had her return marked an ending, the closure of something unfinished? Clara didn't know, and perhaps she wasn't meant to. For now, she let herself sit in the moment, memorizing every detail, the golden light filtering through the trees, the cool grass beneath her, the rhythmic sound of his breathing. The forest, alive and eternal, held them both in its embrace. Clara realized she wasn't just visiting anymore. This was a homecoming. The choice she had to make was whether she would leave again. Her heart whispered the answer before her mind did. The ribbon fluttered in the breeze like a quiet signal, a declaration of presence, of belonging, of memory made tangible. Clara watched it sway against the backdrop of the forest, and for the first time in years, she felt her heart settle. She had left something of herself here again, something to bridge the time she had been gone. The bear, meanwhile, had lowered himself fully into the grass, his bulk pressed into the earth as though he intended to stay for as long as she did. His calm was almost impossible to believe. Clara thought back to how the villagers had spoken of him in fearful whispers, their stories painting him as a phantom that haunted the forest. But sitting here now, watching him rest with such ease, she realized that they had only ever seen the surface of him. They had seen a shadow, she had known the soul, Clara hugged her knees to her chest, the cool earth beneath her seeping through her skirt. She remembered how, as a child, she had once sat in this very posture, whispering secrets into the silence. Now, as an adult, she wondered if the bear had carried those secrets with him all these years. Did he remember the sound of her laugh? Did he remember the way she once skipped through the grass with ribbons in her hair? She couldn't know, but something in his steady presence told her yes. She found herself speaking again, her voice soft. "Do you know how many times I almost came back? There were days when I was younger that I thought I would drop everything and run home. But then life," she shook her head. "It has a way of trapping you in things you don't even choose. Work, obligations, survival. I told myself I'd come when I had time. But time never appeared. And I hated myself for it." The bear shifted, exhaling a heavy sigh that stirred the grass around his muzzle. Clara blinked through the sting in her eyes. "But maybe," she continued, "maybe you knew. Maybe you understood that I couldn't, even if I wanted to. Because you didn't give up. You still came back. You waited for me." Her throat tightened at the thought. She realized that in many ways, he had shown her something no human ever had, constancy without demand. He had never come to the village looking for her, never broken the forest's silence with complaint or impatience. He had simply returned, year after year, holding the promise they had once made. She wondered if he had ever doubted, ever stood in the clearing wondering if she had forgotten him. The thought broke her heart, but she let it in, because it made her presence here all the more vital. Her gaze drifted to the scar again, pale and sharp against his fur. She found herself leaning forward, whispering as though afraid of breaking the air between them. "That scar. I used to imagine it made you braver. But I think it's more than that. It's proof. Proof that you endured, just like this bond endured." The bear's eyes, dark and endless, blinked once more. Clara's lips trembled into a faint smile. She stretched her hand toward the grass again, palm open, not demanding but offering. This time, the bear shifted his massive body and inched closer. Each step was deliberate, the earth pressing under his weight. Clara's pulse raced, but she held steady, her body humming with both fear and trust. Finally, he stopped only a short distance away, close enough that she could hear the sound of his breath clearly, close enough that she could see the texture of his fur in detail. Her hand hovered in the space between them, and though he didn't close the distance entirely, he lowered his head just slightly, acknowledging her offering. Her breath shook as tears rolled down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for remembering me." The silence of the forest wrapped around them again, but now it was different. It wasn't the silence of emptiness but of presence, two lives that had walked separate paths now reunited in stillness. Clara realized that no words could truly explain this bond, not to anyone in the village, not to anyone in the world beyond these trees. It wasn't something to be explained. It was something to be felt, something to be carried like a secret inside her chest. She lowered her hand at last, wiping her face, and leaned back into the grass. The bear, as if in answer, settled fully onto his side, his great body stretched across the clearing. The sight nearly undid her again. He was vulnerable like this, choosing to rest near her when he could have disappeared back into the woods. She felt the trust in that gesture as keenly as she had ever felt anything in her life. The forest seemed to approve. A gentle wind swept through, rustling the trees, carrying with it the scent of pine and earth. Overhead, a hawk circled lazily against the sky. Clara lay back in the grass, staring up through the shifting canopy. The ribbon she had tied fluttered at the edge of her vision, and she smiled faintly. She knew she couldn't stay forever, not today. Life outside the forest still called to her, demanding her return. But she also knew this wasn't the end. She wouldn't let 20 years pass again. She would come back, and not just once. She would return every spring if she could, to keep her side of the promise alive. She turned her head toward him one last time before closing her eyes. "This isn't goodbye," she whispered. "Not anymore." The bear's ears flicked, and his breathing remained steady. Clara smiled through her tears. The clearing, once a place of longing, had become a place of reunion. For the first time since childhood, she felt certain that she belonged here, and that the forest, and the bear, would always welcome her back. When Clara finally left the clearing that evening, the forest felt different. Not threatening, not heavy, but alive in a way she hadn't felt since childhood. Each sound seemed clearer, each breath of wind more deliberate. The bear had remained behind, stretched out in the grass, his dark eyes following her until the trees swallowed her figure. She had whispered a soft goodbye, though it hadn't felt like an ending. It had felt like a promise renewed. That night, as she lay in the small room she had rented in the village nearby, Clara barely slept. Her body ached from the long walk, but her mind replayed every detail of the encounter. The way the scar on his face caught the light, the way his breathing had steadied her own, the weight of his silence that felt like understanding. For years, she had wondered if the bond she remembered was nothing more than the imagination of a lonely child. Now she knew it had been real all along. In the following days, Clara found herself drawn back to the forest again and again. She didn't need directions. Her feet carried her unerringly toward the clearing, as though no time had passed at all. Each time, she found him there. Sometimes he was already waiting, massive and still as a statue among the trees. Other times, she would arrive first and wait, her heart racing until his shadow emerged from the undergrowth, as inevitable as the turning of seasons. Their routine became unspoken. Clara would sit, sometimes talking to him, sometimes just existing in silence. She told him stories of the life she had lived away from the forest, the fields she had worked in, the people she had met, the roads she had walked that had never felt like home. She told him about her parents, now old and gray, who still spoke little of the fire but carried its scars in their weary eyes. She confessed how she had always thought of him in secret, afraid to share the memory with anyone who would never understand. The bear never responded in ways another human might. But he stayed. And in his staying, Clara found the answer she had needed all along. One afternoon, as golden sunlight poured through the canopy, Clara sat with her back against a tree, watching him forage lazily at the edge of the clearing. He moved with surprising grace for his size, his powerful limbs steady, his head lowered as he pawed gently at the earth for roots. She felt a smile spread across her face. "Do you know you've become a legend?" she asked softly. "The villagers tell stories about the scarred bear who returns every year. They think you're a mystery, a danger. But they don't know you like I do." The bear lifted his head, dirt clinging briefly to his muzzle, and looked at her. Clara laughed quietly. "They don't know that you're patient. That you're gentle. That you wait when no one else would." Her voice grew quieter, more contemplative. "Do you know what that means to me? To have someone, even if you're not human, even if you can't tell me in words, to have someone prove that I was worth remembering?" Her throat tightened, but she pressed on. "I've spent my whole life feeling like I was in the wrong place. But when I'm here, with you, I feel like I belong. I think." I think this is where I was always meant to return. The bear shifted his weight, his paws pressing into the grass, his bulk lowering into a seated position again. Clara felt her chest tighten. She wondered if he understood, if in some instinctual way he knew that she was telling him not just her past but her heart. As days passed, her bond with the forest deepened again. She began to notice details she had long forgotten, the patterns of birdsong at dawn, the faint scent of wild mint along the streams, the way the forest floor softened after rain. Each moment felt like rediscovery, as though the land itself was reintroducing her to the childhood she had left behind. And always, at the center of it all, was the bear. The villagers noticed her absences. They asked questions when she returned from long walks, their curiosity thinly veiled as caution. "You shouldn't spend so much time in there," one woman warned. "That scarred bear is still around. He's dangerous, Clara. He's not what you think he is." Clara had smiled faintly, keeping her truth close. "He hasn't harmed me," she replied simply, which only made the woman frown deeper. She knew they wouldn't understand. To them, the bear was a creature to fear, a story to tell around firelight. To her, he was the keeper of a promise, the guardian of her past. He was proof that memory and loyalty could exist beyond the bounds of human understanding. One evening, Clara lingered in the clearing longer than usual. The sky deepened to shades of violet, stars blinking faintly overhead. The bear sat a short distance away, his dark form blending into the shadows, yet his presence unmistakable. Clara wrapped her coat tighter around her, her breath visible in the cooling air. "I should go," she murmured. "But it's hard to leave. Every time I do, it feels like I'm tearing myself away from something I need to survive." The bear exhaled heavily, his breath clouding in the fading light. Clara's heart ached. She pushed herself to her feet slowly, brushing the grass from her skirt. "I'll come back," she promised again, her voice steady this time. "Not years from now. Tomorrow. The day after. As often as I can." She glanced at the ribbon still tied to the branch, fluttering faintly in the evening wind. Its presence filled her with comfort. It was proof that this bond wasn't just memory anymore. It was alive. And as she turned to leave, the bear remained, still and silent, a shadow of strength and patience. Clara carried his image with her through the darkened forest, her heart full in a way it had not been since she was a child. Clara's visits to the forest became the rhythm of her days. Each morning, she woke before the sun, her body humming with anticipation, her feet already itching to tread the familiar path. She carried small offerings in her pack, berries, bread, sometimes just the ribbon she had tied, which she would straighten and retie as though renewing her vow. The villagers gossiped about her strange routine, their voices laced with both worry and curiosity. But Clara didn't mind. She had waited 20 years for this return, and now she was unwilling to waste even a single day. The bear was always there. Sometimes she found him already waiting in the clearing, a steady presence among the wild grass. Other times, she would arrive first and feel the weight of expectation, her eyes searching the tree line until his shadow emerged. The moment his form appeared between the trunks, her chest would loosen, her breath would even out. His arrival was no longer a question, it was a certainty. One morning, Clara entered the clearing carrying a small pouch of berries she had gathered. She placed them on the grass in front of her as she sat cross-legged. The bear lumbered forward slowly, sniffed them, then ate with deliberate care. Clara laughed softly, shaking her head. "You've spoiled me," she admitted. "I've never had someone listen to me this much." You let me ramble for hours, and you don't complain." Her voice faltered as the weight of her words pressed against her. "Do you know what that means? That someone would stay? That someone would choose not to leave, not even once." She bit her lip, her eyes stinging again. I think you might have saved me, even when you weren't here. Just knowing you might still be waiting gave me a reason to keep hoping." The bear settled into the grass, his large body folding with surprising grace. He blinked slowly, his gaze fixed on her. Clara tilted her head, smiling faintly through her tears. "You always answer like that," she whispered. "One blink, as if you're saying yes. You have no idea how much that used to mean to me when I was little. Maybe you do." Silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. The forest pulsed with life, the chatter of squirrels overhead, the whistle of a distant bird, the rustling of branches as the wind swept through. Yet in the middle of it all, Clara felt as though the clearing belonged to just the two of them, sealed off from the rest of the world. Her thoughts drifted to her parents. They were older now, frail in ways that frightened her. They had survived the fire, but it had left them wary, unwilling to speak of the forest they had lost. Clara had once tried to tell her mother that she dreamed of the bear, that she thought of him every spring. Her mother had silenced her with a sharp look and a trembling voice. "Don't speak of that place. It's gone." But it wasn't gone. Not entirely. It had been waiting, just as he had. And now, sitting in the grass with the bear's steady presence beside her, Clara wondered if her parents had been wrong to leave forever. She didn't resent them for it, she understood their fear. But for her, the forest wasn't a place of danger. It was home. She leaned back on her hands, staring up at the canopy. The light filtered through in fractured beams, casting golden patches across her face. "Do you think," she asked softly, "that we're the same? That maybe you stayed because you couldn't forget, and I came back because I couldn't either?" The bear shifted slightly, his scar catching the light. Clara swallowed hard. She wished she could reach out and touch him, wished she could press her palm against his fur and feel the solidity of him. But she didn't push. Trust wasn't something to be demanded. It was something to be given, as freely as the patience he had shown her all these years. The days blurred into one another. Each visit carved deeper into her heart the truth she had always known: she belonged here, with him, with the forest that had shaped her. She began to speak less and listen more, letting the sounds of the woods wash over her. She noticed how the bear's movements echoed the rhythms of nature, deliberate, unhurried, timeless. One evening, as dusk settled and the sky burned orange, Clara lingered in the clearing long after she should have left. The bear was lying nearby, his head resting on his paws. Clara pulled her coat tighter, the air growing cold. "I don't want to leave tonight," she admitted softly. "I know I have to. But every time I step away, it feels wrong. Like I'm leaving behind a piece of myself." Her voice wavered. "I've spent too many years leaving. Leaving my home, leaving you, leaving pieces of who I was behind. I don't want to do it anymore. Not with you." The bear lifted his head, his eyes glinting faintly in the fading light. Clara felt a sob rise in her throat. "I wish I could stay. I wish I could build a cabin here again, plant herbs with my mother, chop wood with my father, run through the trees like I used to. But I can't bring back what's gone. All I can do is choose where I'll stand now. And I choose here." The words left her mouth with a certainty that startled her. She pressed her palm into the grass, grounding herself. The bear blinked once, his slow, deliberate way of answering. Clara laughed through her tears. "That's your yes again," she whispered. "I'll take it." The stars appeared faintly overhead, one by one, as the forest grew darker. Clara finally rose, her body aching from the cold and stillness. She took a step back toward the path but turned to face him again. "Tomorrow," she promised. "And the day after. As long as I can." The bear did not move as she left, but she felt his gaze on her until the trees closed behind her. The clearing, she realized, was no longer just a memory. It was her present, and if she chose it, it could be her future too. The days stretched into weeks, and Clara's life became bound to the rhythm of the forest once more. She still returned to the village each night. The practical side of her knew she couldn't sleep out in the woods without preparation, but her heart was anchored firmly in the clearing. Every morning, she would rise before the sun and walk the path, her feet carrying her through the shadows until the first light touched the trees. And every morning, he was there. It amazed her, the constancy of it. There were days when she doubted, when she thought surely the magic of their reunion would break, that she would step into the clearing and find it empty. But it never was. Whether standing tall in the early light, or resting in the grass, or lumbering slowly through the undergrowth, the bear was always there. Always waiting. Clara began to notice things she hadn't before. She saw how he moved with the seasons, slower and heavier in the chill mornings, more restless in the heat of midday. She noticed how he sometimes carried the scent of rain in his fur, evidence that he had wandered along riverbanks. She saw how his ears flicked at the smallest sound, his instincts always alert, even when he seemed at ease. And she realized, with awe and a pang of sorrow, that he was aging. It wasn't just the silver streaks in his fur, though those were more prominent now that she saw him daily. It was the way he shifted his weight more carefully, how his breaths sometimes came in deeper, heavier pulls. He was strong, still formidable, but time had etched itself into his body. Clara felt a pang of panic when she noticed it, an ache in her chest at the thought that their time together might be shorter than she wanted. One afternoon, she sat with him as the sun filtered gold through the canopy. "I wish I had come back sooner," she confessed, her voice low. "I wasted so many years away from here. I thought I had time. But now I see it, time is running faster than I thought." The bear turned his head toward her, his scar catching the light. Clara swallowed the lump in her throat. "I don't know how many more springs we'll get," she admitted. "And that terrifies me." Her eyes burned as she whispered, "But maybe it's not about how long. Maybe it's about being here now. About not wasting what's left." For a long time, they simply sat together in silence, the clearing filled only with the sounds of the forest. Clara pressed her palms into the grass, grounding herself in the present moment. She forced herself not to dwell on what the future might hold but to savor what was before her now, his massive frame resting in the sunlight, his breathing steady and sure. That night, as Clara lay awake in her small room, she thought about the fire that had driven her family away. She thought about the smoke, the chaos, the fear that had swallowed her childhood in one night. And she realized something that made her heart ache: the bear must have come back the very next spring. He must have returned to the clearing to find her gone, year after year, waiting without knowing if she would ever keep her promise. The thought made her weep silently into her pillow, guilt and gratitude tangled together. The next day, Clara returned with something more deliberate than berries or bread. She carried a carved piece of wood, rough but heartfelt, the beginnings of a small figure she had whittled with a knife borrowed from the innkeeper. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. She set it carefully at the base of the tree where her ribbon still fluttered, a marker that she was not leaving again. When the bear arrived, lumbering into the clearing as steady as ever, Clara gestured toward it. "It's not much," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "But I wanted to leave something more. Something to say that I'm not going to disappear again." The bear sniffed the air faintly, his eyes flicking from her to the carving. Clara smiled faintly through her tears. "You've waited long enough. Now it's my turn to stay." For the first time since her return, Clara felt the weight of her decision settle fully inside her. She could not go back to a life of absence. The forest had called her home, and she would not ignore it again. As twilight fell and the air grew colder, she stayed longer than usual, her body curled in the grass as the stars blinked awake overhead. The bear lay nearby, his dark shape blending with the shadows, but she could still feel his presence, steady, constant, eternal. In that moment, Clara knew the truth: even if he could not stay forever, the bond they shared would. It was carved into the forest itself, into the earth of the clearing, into the ribbon that fluttered and the carving she had left behind. Even if one day she came to the clearing and found it empty, she would never again doubt what had been between them. The bear had waited for her. Now, she would wait for him, however long they had left. The days turned colder as summer edged into autumn. The forest shifted with the season, leaves turned from deep green to shades of amber, gold, and crimson, carpeting the ground with a rustling quilt. The air was crisper now, sharper in Clara's lungs, and the smell of pine was stronger in the cool wind. Every change reminded her that time was moving forward, unstoppable, carrying with it both beauty and loss. But still, the bear came. Every morning, Clara found him in the clearing. Some days he stood, his broad shoulders squared like a sentinel. Other days he lay in the grass, breathing deeply as if the forest itself fed his strength. And every time, he acknowledged her with that same steady look, that same slow blink that she had once taken for coincidence but now understood as something closer to recognition. Clara began to spend longer hours in the clearing, even when the cold bit through her coat. She brought small gifts when she could: food, carved figures, flowers pressed into bundles. But she also began to realize that the bear didn't need any of it. He didn't stay because of what she gave. He stayed because of who she was, because of the bond they had carried since childhood. That truth humbled her more deeply than she could put into words. One morning, frost glistened across the grass when Clara entered the clearing. The bear was already there, his breath puffing white in the cold air. Clara pulled her coat tighter, her boots crunching softly as she walked to her usual place. She sat, letting the silence settle, before whispering, "I wish I could stop time. Just freeze this moment, keep it forever." Her eyes lingered on his scar, on the streaks of silver that gleamed in his fur. The sight made her chest ache. "You've waited so many years for me. And now that I'm finally here, I'm terrified that it's not enough. That I don't have enough time left with you." Her voice cracked, and she pressed her hands together, bowing her head. "I should have come back sooner. I should have never left you to wait alone." The bear shifted, his great body lowering into the grass. Clara lifted her eyes, meeting his gaze. He blinked once, slowly, deliberately. Clara exhaled shakily, a tear sliding down her cheek. "That's your yes again," she whispered. "Your way of telling me it's okay. That it doesn't matter how late I was, just that I came back." She leaned back, staring at the canopy of fiery leaves above. The forest hummed with life around them, even as it prepared for winter. She thought of the years she had wasted, the life she had tried to build elsewhere. None of it mattered now. What mattered was here, in this clearing, with him. Clara knew she couldn't control time. The bear was old, the years weighed heavily on him. One day, perhaps soon, she might step into the clearing and find only silence. The thought tore at her heart, but she didn't let it break her. Instead, she held on to what they had now, to the presence he still gave her freely. And she made a choice. That evening, when she returned to the village, she didn't go to the small rented room. Instead, she went to the edge of the market and spoke to a carpenter. She asked for wood, nails, tools. She asked for supplies, not for trade but for herself. The villagers watched her strangely as she gathered what she needed, their eyes filled with doubt, but Clara's resolve didn't waver. She was done leaving. Over the following days, she worked at the edge of the clearing. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to build. A small shelter at first, nothing more than a cabin frame of logs and branches, but enough to stake her claim. She wanted a home here again, not in memory, not in longing, but in truth. The bear watched her as she worked. He didn't interfere, didn't leave, only lingered nearby, his presence a constant companion. Clara spoke to him as she hammered and cut. "It won't be like before," she admitted. "But it'll be enough. A place for me, close enough to you. I don't ever want to be far again." Each night she returned to the village only long enough to rest and gather strength. Each morning she came back to build. The work was hard, her body sore and her hands blistered, but her heart was light. With every beam lifted, with every nail driven, she was stitching herself back into the fabric of the forest. When the cabin was finally finished, small, rough, but hers, Clara stood in front of it, tears streaking her face. She turned to the bear, who stood at the clearing's edge, watching her with the same patience as ever. She smiled through her tears. "This time, I'm not leaving. You waited for me all these years. Now it's my turn to wait with you." The bear blinked once. Clara felt her heart swell. She walked to the ribbon she had tied months before, its fabric faded by sun and weather, and pressed her hand to it. "This isn't just a promise anymore," she whispered. "This is home." The bear lowered himself into the grass, his massive body stretching as he rested. Clara sat nearby, leaning against the cabin wall. The forest was quiet, the sky deepening into twilight, stars beginning to pierce through the branches. She knew they didn't have forever. But she also knew forever wasn't the point. What mattered was this, that they had found each other again, that they had chosen not to let go. The girl who had left the forest as a child had returned as a woman. And the bear, scarred, patient, eternal, had proved that some bonds are stronger than time. Clara closed her eyes, listening to his steady breathing beside her, and felt peace settle into her bones. She was home.